Welcome. I'm Bob von Bargen, President Emeritus of the Armed Forces Heritage Museum. In Serial 1, Howard Brooks told us about the sinking of the cruiser USS Houston by a Japanese armada. He related the battle and his subsequent survival in the water for 2 days. He washed the shore on Sumatra and was taken prisoner by the invading Japanese. Today we will witness his harrowing experience as a Japanese prisoner of war building the China-Burma Railroad. Let us join Howard as he tells us what happened during his 3.5 years of captivity.
They called it the bicycle camp. It had been an old Dutch army place with a group that had bicycles. So stayed there. Stayed there for about a couple months. But still had what we had when we left the ship. No shoes. I didn't get shoes until after we left Singapore. They hadn't been giving us too much food. And everything they did give us, it was just plain rice, and they made throw some vegetables in it. But that was 3 times a day. It turned out to be that's all we had for the rest of the 3.5 years, rice and soup for 3 times a day. But we were there for a couple months, and they put us on a ship. We went up the Bay of Bengal, up toward Rangoon. As we were about to enter this river, 2 big 4-engine planes, but they were so high we could just barely see that they were 4-engine planes. And they were firing at these planes, but we were looking and they weren't even reaching the planes. But it was encouraging for us to see allies, you know. So they took us into Moulmein. That was the beginning of the railroad. I know for the first several weeks, all we did was dig, remove that, pile it up. The railroad was laid out, and there were stakes in the ground and lines drawn. After we would build it up, there would be culverts to make out of wood. And there were stones. You would sit down and you would bang rocks all day long, carry them over and put on top of the fill.
As the railroad moved along, the place where you would stay, would that change?
We would move. It started. We started at like 5-kilo camp, then 15-kilo camp, and then 20-kilo camp. But you would leapfrog over each other. It seemed sometimes you'd work at a place only a couple weeks. Then you'd walk for half a day the next day, or maybe all day. They always had natives who made these bamboo barracks that we lived in. You had your little mat, you lay on that. And if you were lucky, you had a blanket to lay on that.
When would you start?
Typical day, we would get up with daylight. Yeah. And the cooks would have a great big pot. It was always the same thing, morning, noon, or night. And you had to be ready to tango, count off. You had to be lined up, hit your knees, sign, 6. And then you're ready to march and start work. At noontime, they'd yell out, you know, stop, you know. They knew a few words, stop, work, lazy. They knew that word very well. It was usually our soup, what they carried out. We'd be lined up, march by, and you had, most of the time, you had like 30 minutes. We worked every day. There was no days off. But working down through the jungle, when we built a railroad along a cliff, or the cliff was one side of it, oh, you worked for days just making a place to anchor the cliff side. The other side, you had to build up. We had to cut the trees, trim them, haul them in. Thank the good Lord for elephants. We had some elephants that lifted those things many places. We were lucky if we got home before dark. We always considered it very lucky because at dark in a jungle, there's no place darker than a jungle at night.
What about medical care and illnesses?
Well, I was lucky. I had malaria a few times. More than one time I was picked up and carried back into camp, but I always got over it. But for medical treatment, I got a gash on my shoulders. I fell at some place where we were working, and it got infected, you know. And Dr. Epstein took care of it. And you know what he did when I stood up by a tree and put my arms around the tree, and two guys held my hands together, and he took his little knife from his pocket, and he sterilized it in a flame of fire there, and he nipped into this and cleaned it out. He just put an old rag around underneath my arm and around over my shoulder to cover this place up. And you know, you had to be careful and keep it covered 100% of the time because of the flies and getting infections. Some of the guys came home with one leg, all because they got a tropical ulcer.
What was the attitude of the guards, and what was the relationship?
I think they were trained to be mean. When we were digging, and a soldier would walk up and see this line here, no good, no good. And they would slap that officer's face like this, you know. And that was hard to take. It wouldn't have taken much for a bunch of us to grab that guard and cut his throat. But you knew if you did that, you would be cut down quick. I tell you, when it come to a loss of freedom, nobody had a greater loss of freedom than those Japanese POWs that worked on that railroad. We knew there was no place to go. Beyond that jungle was this Bay of Bengal.
You know, in a situation like that, it is so easy to become depressed and give up. What kept prisoners going? What kept you going? Because you were there a long time.
In my mind, always, it's not going to be long. They're going to come. It's going to come to an end. And instead of all those Japanese we see out there, there's going to be American soldiers. We knew that there was going to be end to it. Now, we got news from time to time. I don't know to this day. I know that we had a radio in camp and we got some news. We knew that this is going to be over soon. Maybe not tomorrow or the next day. But we knew that it had to be. We knew that that was the scheme from the beginning. That they're going to lose some way or the other. And that gave us hope.
When you finally, the railroad was finished and they were gone, what happened then?
When we got to the end of the railroad, where the bridge on the River Kwai was, we heard that they're taking groups, train loads every day, down the peninsula to Singapore. They're going on ships to Japan. A British officer was in charge of us. And he says, well, it looks like we're not going to Singapore. They say that we're going to go over to Saigon Harbor. When we arrived into that harbor, and as we were disembarking from this riverboat, there were carrier planes from an American carrier out in the South China Sea. When they started to come over, as we disembarked, so they took us immediately. We crossed the street, only one block, and we had to sit down right there. And these planes dived right over us into the harbor, and they sunk every ship in that harbor. And we sat there and enjoyed that.
Saigon, when did you find out that the war was over?
So one day, they called us for muster. And this was a Japanese army officer. But he said the Japanese emperor has seen fit to end the war. He said, the world does not need any more cruelty that the Americans and the British have brought on all the people. War is no more. You will be going home. You know, when he left, we were in the camp, we never seen another Japanese of any kind anymore. But that day, a big 4-engine plane came in. It wasn't real low, but you could see it good, you know. But they dropped some fairly big things onto the airport. The airport was not far out from the city. Not long after that, come driving into camp in a Jeep were 2 American soldiers. And that Jeep was loaded with candy bars, and I think he had a whole bushel of big bag there of cigarettes, which he dumped out on them. Everybody went crazy.
You have given us a absolutely wonderful memoir of the cruiser Houston and what it was like to be a prisoner of war and to serve valiantly in the Navy. And Howard, all I can say is we are very proud of you. You are, as men like you, you know, they use the phrase "greatest generation." I think you put great in greatest generation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Cruiser Houston. God bless you, Howard.
Thank you.
One can only imagine the joy and pride these prisoners had when the war ended. They would be returning to their homes. Howard was immediately promoted to Chief Petty Officer, and he quickly advanced to the rank of Warrant Officer before leaving the Navy. He went on to become a successful electrical engineer in civilian life. In our next serial, we will share the experience of an Army radio operator who was in the first assault wave onto Omaha Beach during the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Arthur Seltzer will tell you about the horrors of that amphibious invasion as the Americans faced murderous gunfire from the entrenched German fortifications on the bluffs above the beach. It is little known that the Omaha Beach assault was a Coast Guard operation. It was one of the bloodiest days in Coast Guard history. It's quite a story, and it's told to you by a remarkable man, Arthur Seltzer.